nangyayari talaga yan sa unang enkwentro. Lalo sa mga bagong kasulat. Well, merong gusto makipag-usap sa inyo.
Yes, boss. Kami nang bahala rito. Konti lang. Okay lang. Ano, para ko ng bago eh.
Rogie, tulungan mo ko, isakay natin siya. Sino ba ang hinahanap?
Ito ba nakatira si Ate?
Ikaw ba si Rico? Totoo po bang mawawala yung Rico?
Hindi na kailangan dilayin niya. E pusher ng hype na to eh. Kalit, tatandaan mo ba ako? Tapos...
Baka may iniisip lang yun.
The story begins in a world where violence, corruption, and personal revenge have become closely connected to everyday survival. Powerful criminals operate with confidence because fear prevents ordinary people from challenging them, while those responsible for maintaining justice often struggle against enemies protected by money and influence. At the center of this dangerous environment is a man who understands that the law does not always reach the people responsible for the greatest suffering. He has witnessed how quickly innocent lives can be destroyed when ruthless men believe nobody has the courage to oppose them. Although he tries to live according to discipline rather than anger, circumstances gradually begin pushing him toward a conflict where legal rules and personal justice will become increasingly difficult to separate. The growing criminal activity begins affecting people who have no connection to the violent war surrounding them. Armed men use intimidation to maintain control, knowing that witnesses are unlikely to speak, and victims have little protection once they become targets. Every successful act of violence makes the organization more confident, allowing its influence to spread even further. The authorities understand that something larger is developing, but gathering enough evidence against those responsible remains extremely difficult. The criminals rarely expose the people giving the orders, leaving lower-level men to carry out attacks while their leaders remain safely removed from the consequences. This system allows fear to become almost as powerful as the weapons used to enforce it. The central conflict becomes more personal when violence reaches people who were never supposed to become part of the struggle. What once appeared to be another criminal problem can no longer be ignored from a distance. The man caught in the middle realizes that remaining silent may protect him temporarily, but it will also allow the same people to continue hurting others. His experience tells him that rushing into revenge will be dangerous, yet doing nothing feels equally impossible. He therefore begins observing the organization more carefully, trying to understand who controls it and how its members operate before deciding what action to take. Every answer he discovers reveals another layer of danger behind the men visible on the streets. As pressure increases, he becomes aware that the criminals are watching him as carefully as he is watching them. They recognize the difference between an ordinary frightened witness and someone capable of becoming a genuine threat. Instead of confronting him immediately, they attempt to intimidate him through warnings designed to make him withdraw voluntarily. The message is simple: forget what happened, remain silent, and continue living. He understands that accepting those conditions would probably keep him alive, but it would also mean surrendering to the fear controlling everyone around him. His refusal to be intimidated begins transforming him from an inconvenient observer into someone the organization believes may eventually need to be eliminated. The situation becomes more dangerous when another violent incident demonstrates how little restraint the criminals possess. Their willingness to use firearms openly proves that they no longer fear meaningful consequences. Innocent people can become casualties simply because they happen to be nearby when revenge or business disputes are settled. The brutality strengthens the central character's determination, but it also teaches him an important lesson. These opponents cannot be defeated through anger alone. They are organized, armed, and accustomed to surviving challenges. If he intends to confront them, he will need patience, information, and the ability to strike only when the advantage is his. Meanwhile, tension develops between those who believe justice must remain completely inside the legal system and those who have lost faith that the system can protect them. Police officers continue investigating, but witnesses are frightened and evidence disappears before cases can develop. The criminals use this weakness to convince communities that cooperation with authorities will only bring greater danger. The central character respects the purpose of the law, yet each failure makes him question how long innocent people should wait, while violent men exploit every limitation placed upon those trying to stop them. His frustration grows quietly rather than explosively, creating a determination that becomes more dangerous because it is controlled. The .45 caliber pistol gradually becomes an important symbol within this conflict. In the hands of criminals, a gun represents fear and the ability to force others into obedience. For someone seeking justice, however, carrying the same weapon creates a difficult moral question. A firearm can protect an innocent life, but it can also transform anger into irreversible violence within seconds. The central character understands this distinction and refuses to treat the weapon casually. He knows that once bullets begin deciding the conflict, every mistake can cost a life. The challenge is therefore not simply learning when to pull the trigger, but knowing when restraint remains stronger than violence. The criminal organization responds to his continued resistance by increasing the pressure. Threats become more direct, and people connected to him begin facing danger simply because of their relationship with someone who refuses to cooperate. This tactic is designed to break him emotionally. Criminal leaders understand that a determined opponent may accept risks to himself but become vulnerable when innocent friends or relatives are threatened. Instead of frightening him into surrender, however, the strategy produces the opposite result. He now understands that the organization will never voluntarily stop. Even if he disappears, another victim will eventually take his place. The problem must be confronted rather than avoided. A series of encounters begins revealing his ability to remain composed when violence suddenly erupts. He does not possess the reckless confidence of the criminals surrounding him. Instead, he watches their movements, waits for opportunities, and responds only when necessary. This makes him difficult to intimidate because he refuses to behave according to their expectations. Men, accustomed to seeing people panic when a weapon appears, become uncertain when facing someone who remains calm. The psychological advantage begins shifting slightly, but the change attracts greater attention from the organization. Powerful figures who previously considered him insignificant start demanding information about who he is and why he refuses to disappear. As the investigation continues, connections between street violence and more influential figures begin emerging. The men carrying weapons are only the visible part of a larger structure built around money, protection, and loyalty. Removing a few attackers would therefore accomplish very little. Someone else would simply replace them. The central character realizes that any meaningful attempt to stop the violence must reach the people responsible for giving the orders. Doing so will be far more difficult because those individuals rarely expose themselves directly. They operate behind layers of armed protection and expect others to accept the risk while they enjoy the rewards. The authorities also begin recognizing that the situation may escalate beyond an ordinary criminal investigation. Each new confrontation increases the possibility of open warfare between the organization and anyone willing to resist it. Some officers want to prevent further bloodshed by keeping potential vigilantes away from the case, while others privately understand why frustration is growing. The law requires evidence, procedure, and patience, but criminals can act immediately without respecting any of those limitations. This imbalance becomes one of the central pressures driving the story forward. Justice remains the objective, yet the path toward achieving it is becoming increasingly dangerous and morally complicated. The man at the center of the conflict finally reaches a point where neutrality is no longer possible. Too many threats have been made, too many innocent people have suffered, and the organization has shown that silence will never create lasting safety. He does not suddenly become reckless or abandon every principle guiding him. Instead, he accepts that protecting himself and others may require entering the same dangerous world he originally hoped to avoid. From this moment forward, every decision carries greater consequences, because his enemies now understand that intimidation has failed. If they want him removed, they will have to use force. Preparations begin on both sides. The criminal organization increases surveillance and positions armed men where they expect future trouble, while the central character gathers information about their movements and weaknesses. The approaching confrontation is no longer accidental. Everyone involved understands that another violent encounter is coming. What remains uncertain is who will choose the location and timing. The criminals believe superior numbers and weapons guarantee control, but their confidence has made them predictable. Their opponent possesses fewer resources, yet he has something they consistently underestimate: the patience to wait until their arrogance creates an opening. By the end of the opening stage, the struggle has developed into far more than a simple confrontation between one man and a group of armed criminals. It has become a test of whether justice can survive in an environment where fear has replaced trust in the law. The 45 carried through this dangerous war represents both protection and the temptation to answer violence with greater violence. As threats become personal and the criminal organization prepares to eliminate anyone standing against it, the man caught at the center understands that the next step may permanently change his life. Once the shooting begins, there will be no easy return to the war that existed before the conflict started. As the conflict grows more dangerous, the man standing against the criminal organization realizes that his enemies are no longer interested in frightening him away. Their warnings have failed, and his continued resistance has convinced them that he could eventually expose the people responsible for the violence spreading through the community. Our men begin following his movements more carefully, waiting for an opportunity to attack where witnesses will be limited and escape will be easy. He recognizes the surveillance almost immediately, but refuses to react impulsively. Instead, he studies their behavior and allows them to believe they still possess the advantage. If a confrontation has become unavoidable, he intends to face it on conditions that give innocent people the greatest chance of remaining safe. The criminals eventually make their move, attempting to trap him in an isolated location where superior numbers should guarantee an easy victory. They expect fear or confusion when the first weapons appear, but their target remains controlled and immediately searches for cover. The encounter quickly turns into a violent exchange where every bullet carries serious consequences. Rather than firing wildly, he waits for clear opportunities and uses the environment to prevent several attackers from surrounding him at once. His discipline surprises the gunmen, who were told they were dealing with someone who could be eliminated quickly. By the time they realize their mistake, the carefully planned ambush has begun collapsing and several members of the group are forced to retreat. News of the failed attack reaches the organization's leadership and creates immediate anger. Their opponent has now done more than ignore threats. He has survived an operation specifically designed to remove him. Allowing that failure to remain unanswered could damage the fear protecting the organization. Criminal authority depends heavily upon reputation, and anyone who survives openly challenging them may encourage others to resist. The leaders therefore increase the pressure and begin searching for another weakness they can exploit. They understand that attacking him directly may no longer be enough. If they cannot control the man through fear for his own life, they will attempt to control him through the lives of people around him. The danger surrounding innocent people becomes the most difficult part of the struggle. He can prepare himself for an armed confrontation, but friends and loved ones do not live with the same constant awareness of danger. The organization begins using this difference deliberately, creating situations where he must divide his attention between pursuing the criminals and protecting those who could become targets. He understands the strategy immediately and feels the anger it is designed to create. Yet, losing control will only make the situation worse. The enemy wants him to rush forward emotionally, exposing himself before he understands their full plan. He therefore forces himself to remain patient, even as the conflict becomes increasingly personal. Meanwhile, investigators continue trying to build a case through conventional channels. They collect statements, follow connections, and search for evidence linking the visible gunmen to the figures directing them. Progress remains frustratingly slow, because witnesses fear retaliation and several important leads disappear before they can be fully developed. The organization has survived for so long precisely because it understands how to exploit these weaknesses. Lower-level members can be replaced, while those at the top remain separated from the crimes through intermediaries. The central character begins realizing that stopping the immediate violence and destroying the larger organization may require two different battles, each demanding a completely different kind of strategy. Another confrontation reveals how deeply the criminals have underestimated the determination of the person they are trying to silence. Several armed men corner him, believing that exhaustion and constant pressure will eventually create a mistake. Instead, he uses their confidence against them. He refuses to remain in the position they selected and moves quickly before they can complete the trap. The resulting gunfight is brief but intense, forcing the attackers to defend themselves rather than execute the plan they prepared. Once again, the .45 becomes a tool of survival rather than intimidation. Every shot is controlled because wasting ammunition or firing carelessly could place innocent people in greater danger. The failed attacks begin creating fear inside the organization itself. Men who previously carried out orders without hesitation now understand that confronting this opponent may cost them their lives. Some begin questioning whether the money they receive is worth continuing the fight, while others become more aggressive because they believe overwhelming violence is the only solution. The leadership responds harshly to any sign of hesitation. Fear has always been used against the public, and now it is turned inward against their own people. Anyone considering withdrawal is reminded that leaving the organization can be just as dangerous as fighting its enemies. Loyalty therefore becomes something maintained through intimidation, rather than genuine respect. As more information emerges, the central character discovers that the violence affecting the streets is connected to a much broader network than he originally expected. Money from illegal activities finances armed operations, while influential connections help important figures avoid consequences. The organization does not survive simply because its members carry guns. It survives because corruption creates protection around the people who benefit most. This realization changes his objective. Eliminating individual attackers may protect him temporarily, but it will not stop the system producing them. He needs evidence or an opportunity capable of exposing the leadership itself. Otherwise, another group of gunmen will simply appear after the current ones are gone. The pressure also begins affecting his relationship with those trying to keep him within legal boundaries. They understand his frustration, but warn that crossing certain lines could transform him from a victim defending himself into someone the authorities are forced to pursue. He accepts the warning because he does not want revenge to replace justice. At the same time, he questions what meaningful choice remains when criminals repeatedly attack while legal action develops too slowly to protect immediate targets. This tension becomes increasingly difficult to manage. He wants the law to succeed, but survival sometimes requires decisions that cannot wait for an investigation to reach its conclusion. The organization eventually attempts a more calculated operation designed to draw him away from safety. Rather than attacking without warning, they create a situation involving someone he cannot simply abandon. The plan is intended to force him into a predictable route where armed men can prepare positions in advance. He recognizes that it may be a trap, but refusing to respond could leave an innocent person in serious danger. This is exactly the kind of choice his enemies wanted to create. They believe emotional responsibility will force him to abandon caution. Instead, he begins preparing for the trap while searching for a way to turn their certainty against them. Entering the dangerous area, he moves carefully and avoids the most obvious path. The criminals wait where they expect him to appear, unaware that he has already identified several of their positions. When the confrontation begins, surprise briefly belongs to him rather than them. He uses cover, movement, and controlled fire to break through the ambush while continuing toward the person he came to protect. The gunmen respond with overwhelming firepower, turning the location into another deadly battlefield. Yet, the numerical advantage becomes less effective once their positions are exposed. What was supposed to be an execution develops into another costly struggle. The rescue succeeds, but the experience confirms that the conflict cannot continue indefinitely. Each confrontation increases the danger to everyone nearby, and eventually, luck will not be enough to prevent innocent casualties. The central character understands that he must reach the organization's leadership before another trap is created. He begins planning a more direct approach, using everything learned from previous encounters to identify patterns in how the criminals communicate and move. The people at the top believe distance keeps them safe, but every order they send creates another connection that can potentially lead back to them. At the same time, the organization's leaders become increasingly desperate. Their opponent has survived intimidation, ambushes, and attacks against people close to him. Every failure makes them more willing to use extreme violence, creating greater risk for their own organization. Some members begin making mistakes because they are operating under pressure rather than confidence. Information that once remained carefully protected starts leaking through careless conversations and hurried decisions. The central character recognizes these changes and understands that patience is finally producing an advantage. The enemy is becoming less disciplined, precisely because it cannot understand why fear has failed. The struggle is now approaching a stage where both sides know that smaller confrontations will no longer settle anything. The criminals want one decisive operation capable of eliminating the threat permanently, while the opponent wants to reach the people responsible before more innocent lives are placed in danger. The authorities remain involved, but events are moving faster than the investigation can comfortably control. Every participant senses that a larger confrontation is coming. The only uncertainty is whether justice will reach the organization before violence determines the outcome first. By the end of this stage, the balance has begun shifting. The criminal organization still possesses greater numbers, money, and influence, but repeated failures have damaged the confidence that once made its members seem untouchable. Their opponent has survived because he refuses to fight according to their expectations, using patience and discipline instead of uncontrolled revenge. Yet, the danger is becoming greater with every victory. The leadership now understands that ordinary threats will never make him disappear, and preparations are beginning for a much more ruthless response. To survive what comes next, he will need more than his 45 and determination. He will need to uncover the structure protecting the people behind the violence before they finally succeed in reaching someone he cannot afford to lose. The struggle enters a more dangerous stage as the criminal organization realizes that repeated ambushes have failed to remove the man threatening its operations. Every unsuccessful attack damages the reputation that once kept entire communities silent, and the leaders understand that fear can disappear quickly once people discover resistance is possible. They therefore begin preparing a more coordinated response, bringing together experienced gunmen and gathering information about every person connected to their opponent. The objective is no longer simply to frighten him. They intend to isolate him completely, remove anyone capable of helping him, and then finish the conflict on their own terms. Their increasing desperation, however, also makes their movements easier to detect, giving investigators their first meaningful opportunity to follow connections leading toward the organization's leadership. Information gathered from the earlier attacks begins revealing patterns that were previously hidden. Vehicles, meeting locations, and intermediaries repeatedly connect the street gunmen to individuals operating behind respectable appearances. The man at the center of the conflict realizes that the organization depends upon a chain of communication that can become its greatest weakness. The leaders rarely carry out violence personally, because distance protects them from prosecution, but someone must still deliver instructions and payments. Following those people may eventually provide the evidence necessary to expose the entire structure. Instead of immediately confronting every criminal he identifies, he begins watching them carefully, accepting the difficult reality that patience may accomplish more than another gunfight. The criminals respond by tightening security around their operations. Men who once moved openly now change routes and travel with armed protection, while meetings are shifted to isolated locations. These precautions confirm that the organization knows someone is getting closer. The atmosphere among its members becomes increasingly tense because nobody knows which information has already been discovered. Suspicion spreads quickly, with leaders beginning to question the loyalty of their own people. Some lower-level members fear they will be sacrificed if authorities finally build a strong case, while others consider disappearing before the violence becomes worse. The organization that once appeared completely united begins weakening internally under the pressure created by its own brutality. A valuable opportunity appears when one frightened member considers cooperating in exchange for protection. He possesses information capable of identifying people responsible for ordering several attacks, but speaking openly could place his life in immediate danger. The authorities understand the importance of keeping him alive, while the criminal leadership learns that someone may be preparing to betray them. A race begins between those trying to secure the witness and gunmen ordered to silence him permanently. The central character becomes involved because he understands that protecting this one person could accomplish what countless bullets never could, creating a direct path from the violent men on the streets to the figures who believe they remain untouchable. Moving the witness becomes extremely dangerous once armed men begin closing in. Every road and familiar location could contain someone working for the organization, forcing the group to avoid predictable routes. The criminals eventually locate them and launch another attack, turning the escape into a desperate battle for survival. The central character uses his .45 carefully, covering the witness while forcing the attackers away from positions where they could control the road. He knows that killing gunmen is not the true objective. If the witness dies, the organization wins regardless of how many attackers are defeated. Protecting the evidence, therefore, becomes more important than pursuing enemies who retreat. The witness survives and begins providing details about the organization's structure, confirming suspicions that influential figures have been protecting the criminal operation. The information explains why earlier investigations repeatedly collapsed before reaching the people at the top. Money has been used to purchase silence, influence decisions, and ensure that important evidence disappears at convenient moments. The discovery makes the conflict more complicated because the enemy can no longer be identified simply by who carries a weapon. Some of the most dangerous participants operate through offices, meetings, and respectable positions, allowing other men to commit violence while they remain publicly separated from it. For the man fighting against them, this revelation creates another moral challenge. A gun can stop an attacker rushing toward an innocent person, but it cannot easily defeat corruption hidden inside institutions. If he responds to every discovery with violence, he may destroy the very evidence needed to expose the larger network. He therefore begins working more closely with those investigators he trusts, sharing information while remaining prepared to defend himself when necessary. The cooperation is uneasy because everyone knows how quickly information can leak. Trust must be given carefully, and one mistake could reveal the witness's location or expose the next move before it begins. The criminal leadership realizes that the witness survives and reacts with fury. Their greatest fear is no longer the man carrying the .45, but the information now moving toward the authorities. They order every available connection to locate the witness and anyone protecting him. At the same time, they begin destroying records and relocating operations that could connect them to previous crimes. This hurried cleanup produces additional mistakes. People who once believed the organization will protect them start realizing they may instead become disposable evidence. Fear begins turning former allies into potential informants, creating a chain reaction the leadership can no longer control completely. Another attack is launched against people close to the central character, designed to force him away from protecting the investigation. The criminals know he cannot remain in two places simultaneously, and they hope personal responsibility will make him abandon the witness. The strategy nearly succeeds because the threat involves someone whose safety matters deeply to him. He immediately feels the same anger that previously pushed him toward reckless decisions. But experience has changed his response. Instead of rushing blindly toward the location, he coordinates with trusted allies and prepares for the possibility that the threat itself is part of a larger trap. His caution proves justified when armed men are discovered waiting along the expected route. The organization planned to attack him before he ever reached the person supposedly in danger. By identifying the ambush early, he avoids the most dangerous position and approaches from another direction. A violent exchange follows as the criminals realize their plan has failed. The .45 becomes essential again, but the confrontation demonstrates how much the conflict has changed. Earlier attacks caught him reacting to events created by his enemies. Now, he is beginning to anticipate their decisions and force them to respond to him instead. After breaking through the ambush, he reaches the threatened person and prevents another tragedy, but the experience confirms that nobody connected to him will remain safe while the organization survives. Temporary victories cannot solve the problem. Every defeated group of gunmen is replaced by another, and every failed plan creates a more desperate one. He decides that the time has come to move beyond defense and begin dismantling the network systematically. The witness's information provides locations, names, and routines that can be used to identify important operations. Instead of attacking randomly, he intends to apply pressure where the organization will feel it most. The first targets are logistical connections supporting the criminal network. Without transportation, safe locations, money, and communication, our men cannot operate with the same freedom. Authorities begin moving against several smaller operations, while the central character watches for attempts at retaliation. The strategy immediately creates confusion among the criminals. Members accustomed to receiving clear orders suddenly find communication interrupted, resources unavailable, and meeting places compromised. The organization remains dangerous, but its ability to coordinate violence begins weakening. For the first time, the leaders are forced to spend more energy protecting themselves than expanding their influence. This shift also gives ordinary people slightly more courage. Individuals who previously refused to speak begin providing small pieces of information once they realize the organization is no longer invincible. Most are still frightened. and nobody expects the danger to disappear immediately, but the atmosphere begins changing. Fear works best when everyone believes resistance is useless. The surviving witness and the failed assassination attempts prove otherwise. Each new statement strengthens the investigation, creating a growing collection of evidence that becomes harder for corrupt connections to erase completely. The criminal leaders respond by preparing one decisive strike. They understand that if the investigation continues for much longer, arrest and betrayal could destroy the network from within. Rather than waiting for that collapse, they gather the remaining loyal gunmen and plan to eliminate the witness, the investigators protecting him, and the man who has become the symbol of resistance against them. The operation will require significant manpower and carries enormous risk, but desperation has replaced caution. They believe overwhelming violence can restore the fear that once protected them, even if the attack leaves destruction visible to everyone. Information about the coming operation reaches the central character through one of the frightened connections inside the organization. He now faces an important choice. He can move the witness again and continue running, or he can use the information to prepare for the attack and finally weaken the armed force protecting the leadership. Running may preserve lives temporarily, but it will also allow the criminals to regroup and choose another target later. Preparing an ambush of his own could create an opportunity to end the cycle, though it will place everyone involved in enormous danger. He chooses to prepare rather than remain permanently on the defensive. Trusted allies begin positioning themselves carefully while the witness is moved to a location that can be defended without placing large numbers of civilians at risk. Every entrance, escape route, and possible firing position is considered. The central character knows the criminals will arrive expecting surprise and superior numbers, so defeating them will depend upon removing both advantages. His 45 is prepared, but he understands that ammunition alone will not determine the outcome. Discipline, timing, and communication will matter more once the shooting begins. The coming confrontation will be the largest and most dangerous battle yet. The criminals move toward the location believing their plan remains secret. Their leaders stay behind, expecting armed subordinates to solve the problem while they maintain distance from the violence. This confidence may become their greatest mistake. If the attacking force is defeated or captured, surviving members could provide even more direct evidence against the people giving orders. The leadership has therefore placed much of its remaining power into one operation. Victory could restore its control, but failure could expose the entire structure it spent years building. As night approaches, tension grows around the prepared defensive position. Everyone understands that the attackers may arrive at any moment. The witness knows his testimony has made him a target. Investigators know corruption may have compromised normal channels, and the central character understands that people he cares about could still suffer if the plan fails. Yet, he remains calmer than during the earlier stages of the conflict. Anger is no longer controlling his decisions. He has learned that surviving against ruthless opponents requires patience even when every emotion demands immediate action. By the end of this stage, the struggle has finally begun turning against the organization, but that change has made the criminals more dangerous than ever. Your network is weakening, witnesses are speaking, and evidence is moving closer to the figures who once believed themselves protected by money and influence. In response, the leadership has committed its remaining armed strength to one desperate attempt at restoring fear. The man who spent much of the conflict reacting to threats is now waiting for them, fully aware that the approaching battle could determine everything. If he succeeds, the road toward the people behind the violence may finally open. If he fails, the organization will ensure that nobody else dares challenge it again. The expected attack finally begins when armed members of the criminal organization move toward a protected location, believing they still possess the advantage of surprise. Their leaders have committed experienced gunmen to the operation because failure is no longer acceptable. The witness must be eliminated before his information reaches the authorities, and the man who repeatedly disrupted their plans must be removed at the same time. What the attackers do not know is that their movements have already been detected. Defensive positions are prepared carefully. Civilians have been moved away from the immediate danger, and everyone protecting the witness understands that the coming confrontation could decide whether the organization survives or finally begins collapsing under the weight of its own crimes. The first gunmen enter cautiously, expecting frightened defenders who will react the moment they appear. Instead, they encounter silence. Their opponents refuse to reveal positions prematurely, forcing the attackers deeper into an area where their numerical advantage becomes less useful. The man carrying the .45 remains hidden until the criminals commit themselves fully. When the first shots finally break the silence, the attack immediately loses its carefully planned structure. Gunmen who expected to surround the location suddenly find themselves searching for cover while trying to determine where the resistance is coming from. Their confidence disappears quickly because the battle is no longer happening according to the plan given by their leaders. The confrontation becomes increasingly violent as additional attackers move forward. Bullets tear through walls and vehicles while both sides attempt to control the limited routes around the position. The central character fires only when necessary, knowing that ammunition must be preserved and careless shooting could endanger the witness. His objective remains protection rather than revenge. Several criminals attempt to flank the defenders, but the movement has been anticipated and they are forced back before reaching the building. The careful preparation begins proving more effective than superior numbers, demonstrating again that the organization has become too dependent upon fear and overwhelming force to solve every problem. Inside the protected location, the witness realizes how much danger his decision to cooperate has created. He considers surrendering himself in the hope that the attackers will leave everyone else alive. But investigators immediately reject the idea. The organization has already demonstrated that promises mean nothing once someone becomes inconvenient. Giving up will not guarantee anyone's safety and will destroy the evidence capable of exposing the leadership. The witness therefore remains hidden while the battle continues outside, understanding that surviving the night may be as important as everything he has already revealed. His testimony has transformed him from a frightened member of the organization into one of the greatest threats against it. The criminals change tactics after the direct approach fails. Instead of continuing to advance through exposed positions, they attempt to create confusion by attacking from multiple directions simultaneously. The strategy forces the defenders to divide their attention, and for several minutes the situation becomes dangerously unstable. One group nearly reaches the witness before the central character recognizes the movement and intercepts them. A close-range confrontation follows where there is little time for careful planning. His experience and control with the 45 become essential as he prevents the attackers from breaking through. But the encounter also reminds him how quickly a single mistake could destroy everything they have worked to protect. As the attackers suffer losses, some begin questioning whether continuing the operation makes sense. They were promised an easy victory against a small group, yet the prepared defense has turned the mission into a costly battle. Several attempt to retreat, while others continue because they fear what the organization's leaders will do if they return without completing the assignment. This internal conflict weakens their coordination even further. The same fear once used to control communities is now preventing the criminals from making rational decisions. They are trapped between an opponent they cannot easily defeat and leaders who consider failure a betrayal. Eventually, the remaining attackers are forced to withdraw, leaving the organization with one of its most serious defeats. The witness survives, the defenders remain in control, and several captured gunmen now represent additional sources of information. The central character understands that the victory is important, but refuses to treat it as the end. The people responsible for ordering the attack were never present. Once again, they sent others to face the consequences while remaining safely behind the organization they created. If those leaders are given enough time, they may rebuild their forces or disappear before the evidence reaches them. The next move must therefore happen quickly. Interrogations of the captured men begin producing valuable information. Some remain loyal and refuse to speak, but others understand that the organization may no longer be capable of protecting them. They reveal locations used for meetings, storage, and communication, confirming several details already provided by the original witness. More importantly, their statements begin connecting specific leaders directly to orders for murder and intimidation. The protective distance surrounding those figures is shrinking rapidly. Investigators finally possess enough independent information to begin planning coordinated actions rather than isolated arrests that could warn everyone else. The criminal leadership learns that several gunmen were captured and immediately begins preparing to escape. Money, documents, and weapons are moved from familiar locations, while trusted associates are instructed to destroy anything capable of linking the leaders to previous crimes. Their confidence has been replaced by urgency. For years, they believe influence would provide enough time to solve every problem quietly. Now, events are moving faster than their corrupt connections can control. Every hour increases the possibility that another member will cooperate, creating additional evidence and exposing another safe location. The organization is beginning to collapse from the inside even before the authorities launch their final operation. The central character receives information about one of the leaders preparing to flee and understands that allowing him to disappear could prolong the conflict for years. A pursuit begins, but this time the objective is capture rather than simply surviving an attack. The difference changes everything. He must close the distance without giving the criminal an excuse to harm civilians or destroy evidence. The fleeing group is heavily armed and willing to shoot anyone blocking the route, creating another dangerous confrontation through streets and isolated roads. Every exchange brings the pursuit closer to the people who previously remained hidden behind hired gunmen. During the chase, the criminals attempt to create obstacles by firing toward pursuing vehicles and forcing ordinary drivers away from the road. The central character refuses to respond recklessly because innocent people are nearby. He waits until the route becomes clearer before returning fire, sacrificing opportunities rather than risking unnecessary casualties. This restraint separates him from the people he is pursuing. The criminals see everyone around them as expendable if survival requires it, while he understands that stopping them will mean nothing if innocent lives were destroyed in the process. The 45 remains powerful precisely because he refuses to use it without judgment. The pursuit eventually forces the fleeing men into a more isolated area where they can no longer hide behind civilians. A fierce gunfight follows as the remaining guards attempt to protect their leader. The central character moves carefully through cover, eliminating the immediate threats while continuing to demand surrender whenever possible. Some gunmen refuse and continue firing until they are defeated, while others finally abandon the fight once they realize escape is impossible. The leader who once ordered violence from a safe distance is now forced to experience the fear he routinely imposed upon others. Before he can be taken safely into custody, however, another faction within the organization attempts to intervene. Their objective is not necessarily rescue. They fear the captured leader may reveal information capable of destroying everyone connected to the network. This creates a dangerous situation where former allies become willing to kill one another to protect themselves. The central character realizes that the organization has reached the stage where loyalty has completely disappeared. Survival is now more important than the relationships that once held the criminals together, making them unpredictable, but also increasingly vulnerable. The intervention leads to another exchange of gunfire, but the attackers are eventually driven away. The captured leader survives and is transferred into secure custody, where the evidence against the organization becomes even stronger. Faced with the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison while others escape, he begins considering cooperation. The authorities now possess something they lacked at the beginning: a person close enough to the leadership to explain how the entire network functions. His testimony could identify financial connections, corrupt protectors, and the individuals responsible for ordering the most serious crimes. News of the capture spreads rapidly and causes panic among the remaining leaders. Some attempt to flee independently, taking money and abandoning their associates. Others argue that they must launch one final attack before the investigation becomes unstoppable. The disagreement fractures the organization further. People who once appeared united through power are revealed as individuals held together primarily by profit and fear. Once those rewards become uncertain, loyalty disappears quickly. The central character recognizes that the network is close to breaking, but he also knows desperate criminals are often most dangerous immediately before defeat. The authorities begin planning coordinated raids against several locations identified through the witnesses and captured gunmen. Timing becomes critical because moving against one side too early could warn everyone else. The central character provides information from his own observations while insisting that innocent residents near the targets must be protected. The coming operation will involve more than one gunfight. It is designed to remove the infrastructure supporting the organization, seize evidence, and prevent leaders from escaping with the money necessary to rebuild elsewhere. As preparations continue, the remaining criminals discover that one final person close to the central character could still be used as leverage. They understand that killing him has repeatedly failed, so they consider forcing him into surrender through someone he cares about. The plan is desperate, but potentially effective. If they can take a hostage before the coordinated raids begin, they may be able to exchange that person for the captured leader or safe passage. The organization begins moving quickly, knowing they have very little time before the authorities strike. The kidnapping attempt succeeds far enough to create exactly the crisis they wanted. Someone important is taken and moved toward a location controlled by the remaining gunmen. A message follows demanding that the central character cooperate if he wants the hostage returned alive. The threat places him in the most difficult position he has faced. He has spent the entire conflict learning not to allow emotion to control his decisions, but now every delay could place an innocent life in greater danger. At the same time, rushing into the location alone would give the criminals the advantage they desperately need. Instead of surrendering immediately, he studies the limited information available about where the hostage may have been taken. Previous testimony provides clues about several properties used by the organization, allowing him and trusted investigators to narrow the possibilities. The criminals believe their demand has forced him to abandon strategy, but he refuses to give them that advantage. A rescue must happen quickly, yet it must also be planned well enough to prevent the hostage from becoming the first casualty when shooting begins. The challenge is greater than any previous ambush because this time the enemy controls someone he cannot risk losing. The remaining leaders gather at the hostage location, believing the situation offers one final opportunity to reverse their collapse. Weapons are positioned throughout the area, guards watch every approach, and escape vehicles remain ready if negotiations fail. Their plan depends upon the assumption that emotional pressure will make their opponent predictable. They have made this mistake before, but desperation prevents them from recognizing it. The central character prepares his 45 and studies the approach, fully aware that the next confrontation may finally bring him face to face with the people responsible for everything that happened. By the end of this stage, the criminal organization has lost much of the power that once made it appear untouchable. Witnesses are cooperating, gunmen have been captured, leaders are turning against one another, and coordinated raids are ready to dismantle the remaining network. Yet, the criminals have responded by taking a hostage and creating the most personal confrontation of the entire struggle. The man carrying the 45 can no longer remain entirely defensive. He must enter territory controlled by desperate enemies, rescue someone whose life depends upon his decisions, and reach the leaders before they escape. The conflict that began with intimidation is now moving toward a final battle where patience, discipline, and courage will determine who survives. With the hostage now in the hands of the remaining criminal leaders, the entire conflict becomes more personal and dangerous than before. The organization understands that its influence is collapsing, witnesses are cooperating, and the authorities are preparing coordinated raids against its remaining operations. Taking someone important to their enemy is therefore a desperate attempt to regain control. They demand cooperation and threaten immediate violence if anyone approaches the location without permission. The man who has resisted them from the beginning understands exactly what they are trying to accomplish. They want fear to destroy the patience that kept him alive during every previous confrontation. This time, however, the life of an innocent person is directly involved, meaning even one careless decision could produce consequences he can never reverse. Rather than rushing toward the hostage location, he studies everything learned about the organization's remaining hideouts. Testimony from captured members provides possible entrances, guard positions, and escape routes. The criminals believe secrecy still protects them, but their collapsing network has already revealed more information than they realize. Trusted investigators prepare to support the rescue while maintaining enough distance to prevent the hostage takers from panicking. The plan requires careful timing. If the gunmen discover the surrounding positions too early, they may harm the hostage before anyone can intervene. The central character therefore prepares to enter from a less obvious direction, accepting that he may have to face several armed men before assistance can safely move closer. Inside the hideout, tension is growing among the criminals themselves. Some want to exchange the hostage for safe passage and disappear before the authorities close in, while others believe killing everyone connected to the investigation is the only way to restore control. Their disagreement reveals how completely the organization has fractured. Loyalty once appeared absolute because money and fear kept everyone moving toward the same objectives. Now survival has become personal. Each man is considering whether the others might sacrifice him to escape. The leaders try maintaining authority, but their orders no longer carry the certainty they once possessed. Even the guards begin questioning whether defending the organization is worth dying for. The hostage remains frightened but recognizes that panic could make the situation worse. The criminals repeatedly use threats to create psychological pressure, hoping their captive will provide information or convince the central character to surrender. Instead, the hostage watches carefully and begins noticing details about the room, the guards, and their movements. These observations may appear insignificant, but any opportunity to communicate could become important during a rescue. The criminals are focused so heavily on the approaching threat that they underestimate the person already inside their defenses. Their confidence has always depended upon assuming frightened people cannot think clearly, and once again that assumption may create a weakness. Approaching the hideout, the central character encounters the first outer guard and neutralizes the threat before an alarm can spread. He moves slowly because silence remains more valuable than speed. The 45 stays ready, but firing too early could warn everyone inside and place the hostage in immediate danger. Every step therefore requires restraint. He uses shadows, cover, and information gathered from previous witnesses to avoid the strongest defensive positions. The same criminals who repeatedly attempted to overwhelm him with numbers are now being approached individually, preventing them from using their greatest advantage. For the first time, he is entering the heart of their operation on his own terms. The situation changes when one guard unexpectedly discovers him and opens fire. Silence disappears instantly as gunshots alert everyone inside the compound. The central character takes cover and returns controlled fire while moving away from the route leading directly toward the hostage. His objective is to make the criminals believe he is attacking from another direction, forcing guards away from the captive rather than toward them. The strategy works temporarily as several gunmen rush to reinforce the outer defenses. Trusted investigators hear the shooting but wait for the agreed signal, because entering too soon could trap the hostage between both sides. The remaining criminal leaders realize their opponent has refused to obey their demands and order the guards to kill him before he reaches the inner rooms. Gunmen spread throughout the compound, turning hallways and open spaces into dangerous firing positions. The central character cannot simply advance directly. He moves from cover to cover, waiting for attackers to expose themselves before responding. His .45 becomes increasingly important as ammunition begins running low and every shot must count. Unlike the criminals firing wildly in frustration, he refuses to waste bullets. Years of fear and violence have brought the organization to this moment, but discipline remains the advantage its leaders never learned to respect. Several guards attempt to surround him, forcing a close-range confrontation where movement becomes more important than cover. He breaks through before the circle closes completely and uses the confusion to move deeper into the hideout. The gunmen begin losing track of his exact position, creating arguments over where he might appear next. Their lack of coordination becomes increasingly obvious. Earlier in the story, the organization could send men into battle with confidence because everyone trusted the leadership. Now, each surviving member is thinking primarily about personal escape. Their fear makes them dangerous, but it also prevents them from functioning as a single force. The hostage hears the gunfire moving closer and realizes the rescue has begun. One nervous guard remains nearby, becoming increasingly distracted by reports that several of his companions have already been defeated. The hostage waits rather than attempting an impossible escape immediately. When the guard finally moves toward the doorway to check the corridor, an opportunity appears to create enough confusion for the central character to identify the correct room. A sudden struggle draws attention, and the sound gives him the information he needs. He changes direction immediately, understanding that the hostage may now have only seconds before another criminal arrives. Reaching the room requires crossing an exposed area watched by two armed men. Instead of charging forward, he creates a distraction that forces one attacker to leave his position. The remaining gunman becomes easier to isolate, allowing the central character to advance without placing the hostage directly in the line of fire. The encounter is quick but dangerous, and another bullet narrowly misses him before he reaches cover. The conflict has reached the point where exhaustion is becoming as dangerous as the criminals themselves. He has been moving continuously through the compound, yet stopping for too long would give the leaders time to relocate or kill the hostage. Once the hostage reaches safer hands, the surrounding authorities begin moving into the compound. The criminals realize they are being attacked from multiple directions, and their remaining defenses collapse quickly. Some surrender rather than continue a fight they know is lost, while others attempt to reach vehicles positioned behind the hideout. The central character joins the pursuit only after confirming the hostage is protected. His decision demonstrates how far he has moved from the temptation of revenge. The 45 remains in his hand, but the weapon no longer determines his objective. It is simply one tool used to protect lives, while the larger pursuit of justice continues. One of the principal leaders escapes the compound moments before the authorities completely secure it. He travels with several loyal gunmen and carries documents that could expose important connections within the criminal network. Allowing him to disappear would weaken the case and possibly leave the organization capable of rebuilding. Vehicles immediately begin pursuing him through isolated roads where the fleeing criminals fire repeatedly at anyone approaching from behind. The chase becomes dangerous because both sides are moving at high speed while exchanging gunfire. The central character focuses on stopping the escape without creating another uncontrolled battle around civilians. The fleeing group eventually abandons its damaged vehicle and moves into terrain where cars can no longer follow. The criminals believe the change will allow them to disappear through routes prepared long before the investigation began. Their leader knows hidden locations where money and weapons have been stored specifically for emergencies. If he reaches one of them, he may be able to leave the region before authorities establish a wider search. The central character refuses to allow the pursuit to end. After everything required to expose the organization, letting its most important surviving figure escape would leave too many victims without justice. The pursuit continues on foot through difficult surroundings where visibility becomes limited and every piece of cover could hide an armed attacker. The remaining gunmen know they cannot outrun their pursuers forever, so they begin taking defensive positions to buy time for the leader. One by one, confrontations erupt as the central character advances carefully. He understands that these men are no longer fighting for victory. They are fighting to delay him, meaning they may take extreme risks if doing so gives their leader another minute to escape. Patience remains essential, even though every delay increases the possibility of losing the main target. Back at the hideout, investigators discover records confirming the scale of the criminal operation. Names, payments, and connections reveal how violence was protected for so long and why earlier cases repeatedly failed. The evidence means the organization can no longer survive simply by replacing a few arrested gunmen. Its financial and political protection is beginning to collapse as well. Yet the missing leader remains important because he possesses direct knowledge of the decisions behind the most serious attacks. Capturing him alive could complete the case in a way another gunfight never could. The central character finally catches sight of the fleeing leader near another prepared escape point. The criminal is shocked that the pursuit has continued this far and realizes most of his protection is gone. Instead of surrendering, he uses the remaining gunmen to create one final defensive line. The men spread across the area while their leader attempts to reach transportation waiting beyond them. The central character checks his remaining ammunition and understands that there will be no opportunity for careless shooting. The confrontation ahead may be the last major battle, but surviving it will require the same control that carried him through every earlier attack. Gunfire erupts again as the remaining guards attempt to stop him. He moves between cover, returning fire only when targets become clear. Several shots strike dangerously close, forcing him to change position repeatedly. The criminals believe they can keep him pinned down long enough for their leader to escape, but their desperation makes their firing increasingly predictable. He waits for pauses, advances carefully, and gradually reduces the distance. Each defeated gunman brings him closer to the person responsible for ordering the violence that began the entire struggle. The leader finally realizes escape may no longer be possible and turns his weapon toward the approaching man. For the first time, someone accustomed to ordering others to kill must personally face the opponent he tried repeatedly to eliminate. He attempts to justify his actions through power and survival, arguing that everyone involved made choices and that violence is simply the way control is maintained. The central character rejects that reasoning. Innocent people never chose to become victims, and fear cannot transform murder into authority. The confrontation becomes a final test of whether the man carrying the .45 will remain committed to justice or allow accumulated anger to become revenge. Before the final exchange is decided, additional forces begin approaching the area, limiting the criminal's remaining escape options. He understands that surrender could mean spending the rest of his life answering for everything connected to the organization. Desperation therefore pushes him toward one last violent decision. His weapon rises and the central character prepares to respond. There is no satisfaction in the moment, only the recognition that hesitation could cost another life. The conflict that once involved layers of gunmen, threats, corruption, and hidden leaders has finally narrowed to two armed men facing each other without anyone left to hide behind. By the end of this stage, the hostage has been rescued, the organization's main hideout has fallen, and evidence capable of destroying its remaining influence is finally in the hands of the authorities. Most of the armed network has been captured or defeated, leaving its principal surviving leader isolated and surrounded. Yet, the conflict is not completely finished. One final confrontation remains, and its outcome will determine whether the man responsible for so much violence faces justice or dies attempting to escape it. The .45 that has represented both protection and temptation throughout the struggle is ready once again. But the greatest challenge is no longer pulling the trigger. It is deciding what justice requires when revenge would be far easier. The final confrontation begins with the surviving criminal leader realizing that the organization he once considered untouchable has almost completely collapsed. His gunmen have been defeated. The hostage has been rescued. Important evidence has fallen into the hands of investigators, and the escape routes prepared for emergencies are rapidly disappearing. For years, he ordered violence from a safe distance, while other men accepted the danger for him. Now, there is nobody left to stand between him and the consequences of those decisions. Rather than surrender, he raises his weapon and attempts one final act of violence. The man pursuing him remains calm, knowing that anger cannot be allowed to control the moment when everything is finally about to end. The criminal fires first, forcing his opponent behind cover as the last gunfight begins. Unlike earlier battles involving groups of armed men, this confrontation is direct and personal. The leader no longer possesses superior numbers or carefully prepared traps. He has only desperation and the weapon in his hands. The man with the .45 waits for the right opportunity instead of firing wildly. He understands that capturing the criminal alive would allow the legal case to reach everyone connected to the organization, but he also knows hesitation cannot come at the cost of another innocent life. When the leader attempts another attack, a controlled response finally disarms and defeats him, bringing the violent pursuit to an end. With the principal threat neutralized, investigators arrive and secure the area. The evidence recovered from the hideout begins revealing the full structure behind the crimes that terrorize the community. Financial records, communications, and testimony from former members connect the violence to people who believed their influence would protect them permanently. Arrests begin extending beyond the gunmen who carried out attacks, reaching those who financed operations, provided protection, and issued orders from behind the scenes. The collapse proves that defeating a criminal organization required more than winning gunfights. The most important victory comes from exposing the system that allowed violent men to continue operating while believing ordinary rules could never reach them. The rescued hostage is finally safe, ending the most personal threat created during the conflict. For the man who spent so much time fighting the organization, this moment matters more than seeing criminals arrested. Throughout the struggle, his enemies repeatedly attempted to use innocent people as weapons against him. They believed threatening someone he cared about would make him reckless enough to destroy himself. Instead, he learned to control the anger those threats created and place protection ahead of revenge. The rescue confirms that discipline was not simply useful during combat. It prevented him from becoming another man who treated human lives as acceptable sacrifices in the pursuit of personal objectives. The surviving members of the organization begin turning against one another once they understand that their leaders can no longer protect them. Some cooperate with investigators in hopes of receiving lighter consequences, while others reveal additional crimes that had remained hidden for years. The fear that once kept witnesses silent begins disappearing. People who previously believed speaking would guarantee retaliation now see that the network responsible for those threats has been broken. Their willingness to provide information strengthens the cases already developing and makes it far more difficult for corrupt connections to erase the evidence again. For the authorities, the investigation becomes an opportunity to restore some of the trust damaged by years of criminal influence. The organization survived partly because people stopped believing the law could protect them. Every failed case strengthened that belief, allowing criminals to present themselves as more powerful than the institutions meant to stop them. The final arrests cannot repair every loss caused along the way, but they demonstrate that influence and intimidation are not permanent forms of protection. Justice may move slowly, yet once witnesses, evidence, and determined investigators work together, even an organization built around fear can begin collapsing from within. The man carrying the 45 also has to confront what the weapon represented throughout his journey. At several moments, anger could easily have transformed his fight for justice into personal revenge. Every attack gave him another reason to stop caring whether his enemy survived. Yet, doing so would have allowed the criminals to determine what kind of person he became. His greatest victories came when he used force only when necessary and refused to treat killing as the objective. The pistol protected him during moments when violence became unavoidable, but the weapon itself never created justice. The choices made by the person holding it determine whether it became an instrument of protection or destruction. As normal life slowly begins returning, the damage caused by the conflict remains visible. Families have suffered, innocent people have been frightened, and some losses cannot be repaired simply because the criminals responsible have been defeated. The ending, therefore, does not pretend that one final victory can erase everything that happened. Instead, it offers the possibility of rebuilding without the constant fear that controlled the community before. People can begin speaking openly, authorities can pursue remaining cases, and those who survived can finally imagine a future where armed men do not decide every disagreement through intimidation. The central struggle ultimately ends with a clear distinction between justice and revenge. The criminals believed power came from making everyone else afraid, while the man who opposed them discovered that real strength required controlling his own fear and anger. His 45 gave him the ability to defend himself, but patience, courage, and judgment allowed him to survive without becoming identical to the people he fought. The organization is broken, the hostage is safe, and those responsible are finally facing consequences. After a long journey through threats, corruption, betrayal, and gunfire, the battle ends not simply because one side possessed the stronger weapon, but because fear finally lost the power to control everyone around it.